Imagine what it felt like when darkness arrived not as rest, but as threat. When sunset marked not the end of labor, but the beginning of a different kind of vigilance. In the frozen forests and river valleys of the early American frontier, winter camps fell into a silence that was never quite peaceful. The night stretched long, and survival depended on fragile shelters, fading fires, and the quiet patience of those who waited for dawn. Before we step into this slow drift through winter's grip on those early camps, I'd ask one small favor. If you tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, you'll join us for more of these late-night journeys into history's quieter corners. Drop a comment too. Let me know where you are, what time it is, whether you're settling into sleep or just beginning your day. Now ease back. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Let's begin tonight's passage into the cold and the dark. The light begins to fade earlier than you expect, even when you know it's coming. You've been gathering wood for the past hour, moving quickly but not running, because running in snow leads to sweat, and sweat leads to cold that settles deep into your bones. The pile beside the shelter is never quite large enough. You add another armful anyway, knowing that by morning it will seem smaller than it does now. Others are moving through the same tasks, checking the canvas, tightening ropes, clearing snow from the tent's sagging roof. No one speaks much during this hour before dusk. The silence isn't hostile, just efficient. Words take energy, and energy is something you ration without thinking about it. You glance toward the tree line, not because you expect to see anything, but because looking is part of the routine. The trees are dark shapes now, losing detail as the sky turns from pale grey to something heavier. The forest itself seems to be withdrawing, pulling back into its own winter hibernation. You notice how the branches hang lower under their burden of ice, how the spaces between trunks have filled with shadow that looks almost solid. There's a quality to winter light that you've learned to read, a particular dimness that tells you how much time remains before full darkness. Today that dimness came early, pushed forward by clouds that have been gathering since noon. You've developed an instinct for these things, born from necessity rather than study. The sky becomes a clock you check without conscious thought, measuring your remaining daylight in increments too small to name but precise enough to trust. Inside the shelter, the air is already thick with moisture and smoke. The fire pit sits in the center, a shallow depression lined with stones that never seem to hold heat the way you want them to. Someone has hung wet clothing near the flames, and the smell of damp wool fills the small space. It's not unpleasant, just familiar like everything else here. The stones around the fire pit are blackened from weeks of use, stained with soot and ash that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Not that anyone would waste energy scrubbing them, they serve their purpose regardless of appearance. You've noticed how the stones crack sometimes in the night, split by the repeated heating and cooling. Each crack is a small failure, a reminder that even stone has limits to what it can endure. You settle onto the ground, which is frozen beneath a thin layer of pine boughs and a blanket that's more holes than fabric. The cold rises through it immediately, pressing against your hip, your shoulder, the side of your leg. You shift your weight, trying to find a position that delays the numbness. There isn't one, but you keep trying anyway. The pine boughs beneath you were fresh once, fragrant with resin and soft enough to provide cushioning. Now they're brittle and compressed, offering little more protection than bare ground would. You remember the first night here, when these same boughs seemed like luxury, when the shelter felt almost cozy in its newness. That feeling lasted perhaps 3 days before the reality of winter camping settled in with its full weight. The fire crackles, a sound that should be comforting but isn't, because you know how quickly wood burns and how slowly the night passes. You've learned to measure time by the size of the flames, by the number of times someone rises to add fuel. Tonight will require 4 additions, maybe 5. That means waking, moving, exposing yourself to the cold air that rushes in when the shelter flap opens. Each time the flap opens, the temperature inside drops noticeably, and it takes long minutes for the warmth to rebuild. You've learned to tense your muscles in preparation, to brace yourself against the incoming cold, as if physical resistance could somehow lessen its impact. The mathematics of fire tending have become second nature. How many pieces of wood create how much heat for how long? You can judge by weight and dryness whether a log will burn fast or slow, whether it will produce flame or mostly smoke. Your fingers are already stiff, even though you've been keeping them close to your body. They ache in a way that's hard to describe, not sharp, just constant, like a bruise that never heals. You flex them slowly, watching the joints move as if they belong to someone else. By morning they'll be worse, and you'll spend the first hour of daylight trying to coax feeling back into them. The stiffness starts in the smallest joints first, the knuckles that bend when you make a fist. It spreads gradually to the larger joints, the wrists and elbows, until your whole arm feels like it belongs to a poorly articulated puppet. You've tried various remedies, rubbing them together, breathing warm air onto them, tucking them into your armpits. Nothing works for long, though each method buys you a few minutes of reduced discomfort. The others are arranging themselves around the fire, each person claiming a small territory of cold ground. There's an unspoken hierarchy to these positions, based on who arrived first, who works hardest, who complains least. You're somewhere in the middle, close enough to feel the fire's heat on your face, but far enough that your back stays cold. It's always your back that suffers most, that part of you the fire never reaches. The man to your left arrived at camp 2 weeks before you did, which grants him a position slightly closer to the flames. He never mentions this advantage, and you never challenge it, because the social order here is one of the few things that remains stable. The newest arrival sits near the entrance, where drafts are strongest and warmth is weakest. He accepted this position without protest, understanding that comfort must be earned through time and labor. Darkness settles completely now, and the world beyond the shelter disappears. You can hear it, though. The forest adjusting to night, trees contracting in the cold with sounds like distant gunshots, ice on the river, shifting and groaning. These are the sounds you've learned to ignore, the ones that mean nothing. It's the silence between them that keeps you alert, the moments when everything stops and you find yourself listening without meaning to. The river lies perhaps 200 yards to the east, invisible now but audible when the wind shifts. Its groaning has a particular quality, different from the tree sounds, deeper and more resonant. You've walked out to see the river ice during daylight, seen how it buckles and heaves where current runs fastest. The ice is thick enough to walk on in most places, but there are weak spots where dark water shows through, warnings written in a language everyone here has learned to read. Someone coughs, a wet sound that echoes in the small space. It's the same cough you heard yesterday and the day before, getting worse, but not bad enough yet to warrant concern. Concern would require action, and there's no action to take. You have no medicine, no warm room, no way to ease what ails any of you except to wait for spring. The cougher is a younger man, perhaps 25, though the beard and weathering make age difficult to judge. His eyes have the particular brightness that sometimes precedes fever, but he continues working, continues taking his turn with the wood and the fire. Illness here exists in categories, things you can work through and things you cannot. The distinction is clear and brutal, with no middle ground for recovery or convalescence. The fire dims slightly and you watch someone rise to feed it. They move carefully, their breath visible in the firelight, adding 2 pieces of wood instead of 1. It's a generous choice, or maybe a fearful one. More wood now means less wood later, but it also means warmth now, and now is all that feels real. You've made the same calculation yourself on other nights, weighing present comfort against future need. The decision always feels momentous in the making, though you know it changes little in the long run. The wood situation is precarious but not yet desperate. There are still trees within reasonable distance, still branches that can be harvested. The work of gathering is exhausting, but it remains possible. You close your eyes, not to sleep, but to rest them, to give yourself a brief escape from watching the fire. But closing your eyes makes the cold more noticeable, makes you more aware of the dampness in your clothes, the stiffness in your neck. You open them again. Sleep will come eventually, not because you're ready, but because exhaustion wins. Behind your closed eyelids, after images of the fire dance in shades of orange and red. These phantom flames are warmer in imagination than the real fire is in practice. Your neck has developed a permanent ache, a dull throb that starts at the base of your skull and radiates down between your shoulder blades. You can't remember the last time you held your head in a truly comfortable position. The conversation around the fire is sparse, just occasional comments about the next day's work, about the weather, about nothing important. No one discusses what they're thinking about, which is probably the same thing you're thinking about. How many more nights? How much more cold? Whether the supplies will last? These questions have no good answers, so they remain unasked. Instead, someone mentions that the snow looks like it might hold off tomorrow, and someone else agrees, and the silence returns. Weather predictions here are half observation, half wishful thinking. You've all learned to read the clouds, the wind direction, the behavior of what few birds remain, but winter makes fools of even experienced predictors. Tomorrow's weather matters because it determines tomorrow's work, which determines tomorrow night's comfort. Everything connects to everything else in chains of causation too long to fully trace. You adjust your position again, pulling the blanket tighter, even though it provides almost no warmth. It's a gesture of hope more than practicality, a way of pretending you have some control over your comfort. The smoke from the fire drifts toward your face, and you turn your head to avoid it. Your eyes water anyway, adding to the general dampness of everything, your clothes, your bedding, your skin. The blanket in your hands is rough wool, worn thin in places where the weave has broken. You can feel the holes with your fingers, map their locations without looking. This blanket was issued to you when you arrived, pulled from a stack of similarly worn items. You've grown possessive of it despite its inadequacy, protective of this small piece of material that belongs to you alone. Nothing dries completely here. Everything exists in a state of partial wetness, slowly freezing and slowly thawing, never quite reaching either extreme. Your stomach tightens with a hunger that's become so constant you barely notice it anymore. Dinner was a thin stew of dried meat and whatever roots could be dug from the frozen ground, enough to quiet the worst of the emptiness, but not enough to feel satisfied. The dried meat has a texture like leather, and a taste that's more salt than anything else. You've learned to chew it slowly, to extract whatever nutrition and flavor it contains before swallowing. The roots are worse, bitter and fibrous, requiring long cooking to become even minimally edible. Someone claimed they were nutritious, but you've seen no evidence of this beyond the fact that eating them staves off starvation. No one expects satisfaction here. You expect endurance, one meal leading to the next, one night leading to another morning. The wind picks up outside and you hear it moving through the trees before you feel it finding the gaps in the shelter. Cold air seeps in through every seam, every poorly tied rope, every place where the canvas has worn thin. You pull your arms inside your coat, tucking your hands under your armpits. It helps, but only slightly, and only if you stay perfectly still. The coat you wear is heavy canvas, stiff with dirt and age. Its original color is impossible to determine beneath the accumulated stains of work and weather. Inside the coat, pressed against your ribs, your hands find a small amount of body heat. You've learned to keep them there as much as possible, withdrawing them only when absolutely necessary for tasks. Movement means exposing yourself to the air, means losing what little warmth you've managed to trap against your body. So you stay still, breathing slowly, watching the fire. Time loses meaning in the repetition of these hours. You might have been sitting here for minutes or for half the night. There's no way to tell without getting up to check the stars, and no reason to check them anyway. Your sense of duration has become unreliable, stretched and compressed by discomfort and monotony. What feels like an hour might be 20 minutes, or might be 2 hours. The others around the fire have fallen into their own rhythms of stillness and slight movement. Someone shifts every few minutes, someone else coughs, someone adds wood, and these small events mark time more reliably than any clock. The night will end when it ends. Knowing the hour won't make it pass faster. Someone shifts beside you, and you feel the cold rush in where their body had been providing a small barrier. They're trying to get comfortable too, engaged in the same futile attempt to find warmth in a place that has none to offer. You don't look at them. Looking would require acknowledging the shared misery, and acknowledgement would make it more real somehow. The proximity of bodies here is strange, close enough to share heat, far enough to maintain the fiction of privacy. You know the breathing patterns of the men around you better than you know their thoughts. In daylight, you work alongside these people, coordinate tasks, share the load. In darkness, you exist in parallel, separate spheres of private endurance that happen to occupy the same cold space. The fire pops loudly, sending a spray of sparks toward the roof of the shelter. You watch them die before they reach the canvas, tiny points of light that existed for less than a second. It reminds you of how fragile everything is here. The fire, the shelter, the warmth, your own ability to endure. Everything depends on everything else, and any one failure could unravel the rest. The canvas roof shows small burn marks where sparks have landed before, dark spots that could become holes given enough time. No one has repaired them yet because they're small, and because repair takes effort that's needed elsewhere. You imagine what would happen if the canvas caught fire, the panic, the rush to escape, the sudden exposure to full night cold. The thought is paralyzing, so you push it away and focus on the present moment where no disaster is occurring. You've seen it happen in other camps, heard stories of shelters collapsing under snow, of fires dying in the deepest part of night, of men who simply didn't wake when morning came. These stories are told without drama, just facts recounted in flat voices because drama would make them too frightening to bear. Instead, they're treated as information, as lessons about what to check, what to avoid, what to fear without saying you're afraid. Fear isn't useful here, but caution is, and the line between them is something you've learned to walk. The stories come from men who've spent previous winters in camps like this one, who've survived and returned. They share their knowledge matter-of-factly, describing deaths and near-deaths in the same tone they'd use to discuss the weather. You've learned to listen carefully to these stories, to extract the practical lessons without dwelling on the horror. The man who froze to death had taken off his boots. Remember to keep your boots on. The shelter that collapsed hadn't been cleared of snow. Remember to clear the snow. Your legs are cramping now, muscles tightening from the cold and from sitting in the same position too long. You flex your feet inside your boots, feeling the stiffness in your ankles, the numbness in your toes. By morning, your boots will be frozen and you'll have to work them loose before you can put them back on. It's a small indignity among many, barely worth noting. The boots are leather, cracked and worn, with soles that have been repaired multiple times. They fit poorly, too large in some places and too tight in others, but they're what you have. Inside the boots, your feet exist in a constant state of dampness, the leather unable to breathe, your sweat unable to evaporate. You've accepted the inevitability of foot problems, hoping only that they won't become severe enough to prevent walking. The person across from you has their eyes closed, but you don't think they're asleep. Their breathing hasn't settled into the deeper rhythm of sleep, and their jaw is still tight, muscles working even in rest. Everyone here sleeps poorly if they sleep at all. The cold won't allow real rest, only these brief periods of reduced awareness, moments when your exhaustion outweighs your discomfort just enough to let you drift. Real sleep requires a level of comfort that doesn't exist here. What you get instead are these shallow approximations, states of semi-consciousness, where you're aware of the cold but too tired to fully process it. You've had dreams here, strange, fractured visions that blend memory and present circumstance. You dream of warmth, of abundance, of places you've been, but the dreams are always interrupted by some physical discomfort that pulls you back to waking. You listen to the wind again, trying to judge whether it's strengthening or fading. It's hard to tell from inside the shelter, where every sound is filtered through canvas and wood smoke and your own fatigue. The wind matters because it affects the fire, because it finds new gaps to slip through, because it determines how miserable the next few hours will be, but you can't control it, so listening is just another way to pass the time. Wind direction tells you something about coming weather. North wind brings the deepest cold. West wind sometimes brings snow. You've learned these patterns without anyone teaching them, absorbed them through exposure and observation. Tonight, the wind seems to be circling, coming from no fixed direction. This unsettled pattern often precedes a storm, though whether that storm will arrive tonight or tomorrow or next week is impossible to say. Someone adds more wood to the fire, even though it's not quite time yet. Maybe they're cold, or maybe they're just tired of watching the flames shrink. The fire brightens, throwing shadows against the canvas walls. The shadows move with the flames, creating an illusion of activity, of life, when really there's just stillness and waiting. The sudden increase in light changes the atmosphere slightly, makes the shelter feel more inhabited. For a moment, it's possible to imagine this as something other than mere survival, though the illusion doesn't last. You watch the new wood catch, see the bark curl and blacken, see the first flames lick along its length. There's something hypnotic about watching fire consume wood, a process so fundamental that observing it requires no thought. You become aware of your own breathing, of the way the cold air stings slightly when you inhale. You try to breathe through the blanket to warm the air before it reaches your lungs, but it makes you feel smothered, so you stop. Small discomforts become large ones in the accumulation. No single thing is unbearable, but together they create a weight that presses down on you, making every movement feel harder than it should. Your lips are chapped, cracked at the corners, where they've split and bled and split again. You've stopped licking them because that only makes the problem worse, but the urge remains. Your scalp itches beneath your hat, a maddening sensation you can't properly scratch through the wool. Small irritations like this become obsessions during the long hours, thoughts that circle back repeatedly because there's so little else to occupy your mind. You think about your family, if you have one, or about the place you came from, but the thoughts are distant, like memories of someone else's life. This camp, this cold, this night, these are what feel real now. Everything else is something you used to know, something you'll return to eventually, assuming you survive, but survival isn't guaranteed, so you don't think about it too much. The people you left behind feel fictional, characters in a story you once read. You can remember their faces but not their voices, can recall events but not emotions. This disconnection is disturbing when you notice it, so mostly you don't notice it. You focus instead on immediate concerns: fire, wood, warmth, the passing of hours. The fire dims again, and this time no one rises immediately to feed it. Maybe everyone is hoping someone else will do it. Or maybe everyone is too tired to care yet. The cold begins to reassert itself, creeping closer, reminding you that the fire's warmth is temporary, borrowed, something you have to keep earning. You wait, watching the flames shrink, wondering how long before someone moves. There's always this moment of collective hesitation, a pause where everyone waits for someone else to take responsibility. It breaks eventually because it has to, because letting the fire die is not an option. The flames have retreated to coals, now glowing red but producing little visible fire. The temperature drop is immediate and obvious, a reminder of how thin the barrier is between comfort and suffering. It's you. You rise slowly, feeling the stiffness in your joints, the way your body resists movement. You reach for the woodpile, select 2 pieces, place them carefully on the coals. The flames hesitate, then catch, and the warmth returns. Standing requires a moment of coordination, your muscles slow to respond to commands. Your knees crack audibly, a sound that would have concerned you once but now seems merely informative. The wood you select is medium-sized, dry enough to catch quickly, but substantial enough to burn for a while. You've learned to judge these things by feel, even in darkness. You settle back into your spot, which has already grown cold in your absence. The ground seems harder now, the blanket thinner, as if leaving even briefly has reset your tolerance for discomfort. No one thanks you for tending the fire? It's expected, part of the rotation, something everyone does when it's their turn. The brief movement has awakened aches you'd managed to ignore while sitting still. Your lower back protests, your hips feel misaligned, your shoulders carry tension that has nowhere to go. You try to find your previous position, to settle into the hollow your body had created, but it's gone. You must create it again through weight and time. The night continues, measured in these small actions, in the slow burning of wood, in the gradual numbing of your extremities. You drift between awareness and something like sleep, never quite reaching either state fully. When you open your eyes again, nothing has changed. The fire still burns. The others still sit in the same positions. The cold still presses in from all sides. You have no memory of closing your eyes, no sense of how long they were closed. Time has slipped past you, indifferent to your attention. The fire looks slightly lower than before, suggesting some minutes have passed. Someone else will need to tend it soon, continue the rotation that structures these hours. This is the rhythm of winter camp nights, not dramatic, not eventful, just long. You endure them not through courage, but through the simple fact that there's no alternative. Morning will come. It always does. And when it does, you'll rise stiff and cold and tired, and you'll begin another day of the same tasks, preparing for another night of the same waiting. The promise of morning is both comfort and threat. It means the night will end, but it also means facing another day of labor in cold that shows no sign of breaking. The cycle is endless until it isn't, until spring comes or you leave or something breaks. You've stopped trying to count the days, stopped marking time in any conventional sense. There's only now and the vague promise of later, stretched across a winter that feels eternal. For now, though, there's only this: the fire, the darkness, the cold, and the slow passage of hours that feel like days. You close your eyes again, knowing that sleep won't come, but hoping anyway, because hope costs nothing and occasionally provides something resembling rest. The wind shifts outside and a new draft finds its way through the canvas. You pull the blanket higher, tuck your chin down, and wait for morning in the only way you know how, with patience born not of strength, but of having no other choice. The darkness beyond the canvas is absolute, no moon visible through the clouds. This deep darkness makes the shelter feel both more isolated and more necessary, a small bubble of almost warmth in a hostile void. You listen to the breathing of the others, the crackling of the fire, the wind in the trees. These sounds create a kind of music, repetitive and droning, but oddly soothing in its predictability. Your thoughts drift to the work waiting tomorrow, more wood to gather, snow to clear, repairs to make. The list is always long, the labor always demanding, but there's comfort in routine, even when the routine is difficult. Someone coughs again, that same wet cough. You hope it doesn't worsen, hope spring comes before illness becomes crisis, but hope is all you have. The fire needs tending. You can see it in the way the flames have retreated, but it's not your turn yet, so you wait, trusting that someone else will move when movement becomes necessary. Around you, the others exist in their own spheres of endurance, fighting their own private battles against cold and discomfort and time. You're together but separate, connected by circumstance but isolated by the very personal nature of suffering. Another hour passes, or something like an hour. The fire is fed, the cold continues, nothing changes except that you're all slightly more tired, slightly more worn. This is winter camp existence reduced to its essence. Waiting for daylight, maintaining fire, surviving. There's no glory in it, no drama, just the grinding repetition of doing what must be done. Your eyes grow heavy again, and this time you don't fight it. You let yourself drift into whatever approximation of rest your body can manage, knowing you'll wake cold and stiff, but accepting this as the price of brief escape. The fire glows red through your eyelids. The cold wraps around you like a familiar enemy. The night stretches on, indifferent to your discomfort, unconcerned with your desire for it to end. And still you endure, because endurance is all that's asked of you, all that's possible. Tomorrow will come with its demands, and you'll meet them because there's no alternative. For now, though, there's just this endless night, this small shelter, this dying fire that must be kept alive. You pull your blanket closer, shift your weight one more time, and surrender to the waiting that is the truest work of winter. Jean-Baptiste Larocque arrived at his first winter camp in November of 1793, 23 years old and carrying debts that weighed more than his pack. He had signed on with a fur trading company out of Montreal, promised wages that seemed generous until he learned what they expected in return. The camp sat in a river valley somewhere west of Lake Superior, a place with no name that appeared on no map. 6 men lived there through the winter, trapping beaver and marten, waiting for the ice to break so they could transport their pelts downstream. Jean-Baptiste had imagined adventure, perhaps even wealth. What he found instead was a relentless sequence of cold mornings and colder nights, punctuated by work that left his hands raw and his back aching. The journey to the camp had taken 3 weeks, each day stripping away another layer of his optimism. He had traveled with supplies and other men destined for different camps, paddling upstream against currents that seemed determined to push them back toward civilization. The others had been through winters before, and they watched him with the quiet assessment of men who know that not everyone survives their first season. They didn't offer advice unless he asked, and he learned quickly not to ask. His first night in camp, he couldn't sleep. The cold seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the ground beneath him, from the air above, from the very darkness itself. He lay awake, listening to the others breathe, wondering if they were truly asleep or just better at pretending. The fire burned low and no one rose to feed it, so he did, hoping the gesture would earn him some small acceptance. One of the older men, a voyager named Moreau who had spent 15 winters in camps like this, opened his eyes and watched him work. He said nothing, just observed, then closed his eyes again. Jean-Baptiste understood that he had done something wrong, though he couldn't say what. Perhaps he had added too much wood, or too little, or fed the fire at the wrong time. The wood he had chosen was green pine, which smoked heavily and gave little heat. The others used only dry hardwood, carefully selected and stored, but no one had told him this, and he hadn't thought to observe it before acting. These small failures accumulated through his first weeks. He learned by watching, by making mistakes that were never discussed, but always noted. The shelter itself was crude but functional, built from logs chinked with moss and mud, covered with bark and branches. Inside it measured perhaps 15 feet by 12, with a fire pit in the center and sleeping platforms built along the walls. The days fell into a pattern that felt both monotonous and unpredictable. They rose before dawn, checked their traps, skinned whatever they had caught, stretched the pelts, prepared food, gathered wood, repaired equipment, and waited for night. Each man had his own trap line, a circuit that took most of the day to complete. Jean-Baptiste's line was the shortest, given to him because of his inexperience, but it still required hours of walking through deep snow, checking each trap, resetting those that had been sprung. The waiting was the hardest part. Once the work was done and darkness fell, there was nothing to do but endure the hours until morning. The other men played cards sometimes, betting with scraps of leather or promises of tobacco. Jean-Baptiste watched but didn't join, sensing that these games had rules and histories he didn't understand. Jean-Baptiste had brought a book, a collection of poems his mother had given him. He tried to read by firelight, but the smoke made his eyes water, and the cold made the pages stiff. After a few attempts, he put it away. Books belonged to a different world, one where comfort and leisure existed. The book had been wrapped carefully in oilcloth, protected from moisture, but the cold had still damaged it. When he finally unwrapped it months later, he would find that the binding had cracked and several pages had come loose. By December, he had stopped thinking about home. Thinking required energy, and energy was something his body hoarded for survival. His mother's face had already begun to fade from memory, replaced by more immediate concerns: the condition of his boots, the sharpness of his knife, the location of the next trap. These practical matters consumed all his attention. He moved through his tasks with a mechanical efficiency, his mind quiet, focused only on the immediate moment. Check the trap, remove the animal, reset the mechanism, move to the next one. The traps were simple devices, steel jaws that snapped shut with enough force to break bone. Jean-Baptiste had been frightened of them at first, had approached each one with excessive caution, but familiarity bred indifference. The nights grew longer, or perhaps they only felt longer. He lost track of dates, of days of the week, of anything beyond the rhythm of wake and sleep and wake again. One of the men kept a calendar, marking each day with a knife cut on a wooden post, but Jean-Baptiste never looked at it. Knowing the date would have changed nothing. The others seemed unbothered by the monotony, but Jean-Baptiste suspected they were simply better at hiding their feelings. Everyone here wore the same expression, neutral, patient, revealing nothing. There was a hierarchy in camp, though it was never explicitly stated. Moreau was the most experienced, and his judgment on practical matters was final. The others deferred to him without discussion. In January, one of the men fell ill. It started as a cough, the same wet sound that seemed to plague everyone in camp, but it worsened quickly. The man's name was Philippe Trudeau, and he was 27 years old on his 4th winter in the camps. He had seemed strong, capable, unlikely to succumb to illness. Within 3 days the man was feverish, his skin hot to the touch, even as he shivered violently. They gave him extra blankets, kept him close to the fire, offered him what little food he could swallow. They brewed tea from bark and needles, remedies that Moreau claimed had worked before, though his voice carried no conviction. The steam rose from the cup, but Philippe couldn't hold it steady enough to drink. There was nothing else to do. The nearest settlement was weeks away, and the snow was too deep for travel. Even if they had attempted the journey, Philippe would not have survived it. Moving him would have killed him faster than leaving him by the fire. Jean-Baptiste sat with him during the worst nights, listening to his labored breathing, adding wood to the fire whenever it dimmed. The man spoke occasionally, fragments of sentences that made no sense, names of people who weren't there. Once Philippe called out for his wife, describing a house that Jean-Baptiste suspected existed only in memory or imagination. The details were too perfect, too idealized. A hearth that never smoked, windows that let in light but not cold, children who never cried. On the fifth night, his breathing changed. It became slower, shallower, with long pauses that made Jean-Baptiste lean closer, checking to see if he was still alive. Each pause stretched longer than the last, until Jean-Baptiste found himself counting the seconds, wondering if each breath would be the final one. The waiting became unbearable, yet he couldn't look away. Just before dawn, the breathing stopped. The man's face relaxed, and the struggle that had defined his last days simply ended. The silence that followed felt wrong somehow, as if the shelter itself was holding its breath. Then someone coughed, someone else shifted on their sleeping platform, and the ordinary sounds of morning resumed. They wrapped him in canvas and buried him in the snow, digging as deep as they could into the frozen ground. Moreau spoke a few words in French, something about God and rest, but the wind scattered them before Jean-Baptiste could hear them clearly. The ground was frozen solid below 2 feet, and their shovels rang against it like iron striking stone. They laid Philippe in the shallow depression they had managed to create, and covered him with stones and snow. They returned to camp and continued their work. There was no ceremony, no day of mourning, no pause in the routine. Philippe's belongings were divided among them according to need. Jean-Baptiste received his spare blanket, which he needed desperately, and felt no guilt about accepting it. That night, Jean-Baptiste lay awake again, not from cold, but from the sudden understanding of how fragile everything was. The man who had died was younger than Moreau, stronger than most of them, and yet he had simply stopped. He thought about the body lying under the snow, already beginning its slow transformation into something else. By spring, animals would have found it, scattered it, reclaimed it for the forest. The illness could have chosen any of them. It might still choose him. Jean-Baptiste examined his own body for signs of sickness, checking his throat, monitoring his breathing, feeling for fever. Everything seemed normal, but Philippe had seemed normal too until he wasn't. This thought should have frightened him, but instead it brought a strange calm. Fear required the belief that you could change your circumstances, and Jean-Baptiste no longer believed that. He could tend the fire, check the traps, gather wood, and wait for morning. Beyond that, everything was chance. The acceptance of this fact was liberating in a way. If nothing he did mattered beyond the immediate task, then the weight of the future dissolved. He existed only in the present moment, and the present moment required only that he continue. February brought a cold that felt different from the previous months, deeper, more absolute, as if the air itself had frozen. The fire struggled to provide warmth, and they burned through wood faster than they could gather it. The sky remained clear for weeks, which meant the cold intensified each night. Jean-Baptiste learned that clouds provided insulation, that clear nights meant temperatures that could kill exposed skin in minutes. Jean-Baptiste's fingers cracked and bled from the constant exposure. He wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt, but the cloth grew stiff with blood and cold and had to be changed daily. He had stopped feeling pain in his fingertips weeks ago, which Moreau said was a bad sign. Frostbite began with numbness, progressed to blackening, ended with loss of digits, or worse. His boots were falling apart, the seams splitting, the leather hardened beyond repair. He stuffed them with moss and grass, anything to keep his feet separated from the frozen ground, but nothing worked for long. Each morning he examined his toes, checking for the telltale white patches that indicated freezing tissue. So far he had been lucky, but he knew the luck couldn't last forever. The others were in similar states of deterioration. Their clothes were patched and repatched, their equipment held together with improvised repairs, their bodies growing thinner despite their efforts to ration food carefully. The youngest of them, a boy named Thomas, who couldn't have been more than 18, had developed a persistent tremor in his hands. He spilled things constantly, struggled to hold his tools, but said nothing about it. No one complained. Complaining implied that things could be different, and they couldn't. To complain would be to suggest that someone was responsible for their suffering, that some authority could be appealed to for relief. But there was no such authority, no relief available. One night, Moreau told a story. It was unusual. They rarely spoke after dark, but perhaps the silence had grown too heavy, even for him. The fire had burned down to coals, casting shadows that made their faces appear hollow and ancient. Moreau's voice emerged from the darkness, quiet but clear. He described his first winter camp 30 years earlier, when he was even younger than Jean-Baptiste. He spoke about the cold, about watching men die, about learning that survival was mostly patience and a little luck. In that first winter, Moreau said, 3 men had died. One from illness like Philippe, one from an accident with an axe, one who had simply walked into the forest one morning and never returned. "You think you'll remember all of this," Moreau said, his voice quiet in the darkness. "You think these nights will stay with you forever, but they don't. You forget the cold, you forget the fear. You only remember that you survived, and that becomes enough reason to do it again." Moreau paused, and in the silence, Jean-Baptiste could hear the wind moving through the trees outside, a sound that had become as constant as his own heartbeat. The old voyageur shifted position, and his joints cracked audibly. Jean-Baptiste listened, understanding that Moreau was offering something close to comfort, or perhaps just explanation. This was what life became for men like them, a series of winters endured and forgotten, each one preparing you for the next. The story didn't make Jean-Baptiste feel better, exactly, but it provided context. He wasn't the first to struggle, wouldn't be the last. His suffering was unremarkable, ordinary, barely worth noting. March arrived with no softening of the cold. If anything, it felt worse, as if winter was making a final assertion of its power before releasing them. The supplies were running dangerously low. They had underestimated their needs or overestimated their trapping success. Either way, the remaining food would have to be stretched thin for however long the winter lasted. The ice on the river groaned constantly, shifting and cracking, creating sounds that echoed through the valley. Jean-Baptiste had learned to identify the different sounds, which ones meant the ice was settling, which ones meant it was breaking, which ones meant nothing at all. Sometimes the sounds were so loud that he startled awake, certain that some catastrophe was occurring. But it was only the ice, adjusting to temperature changes, expanding and contracting in its slow dance with the seasons. He spent his nights listening to the ice and the wind and the breathing of the men around him. These sounds had become so familiar that their absence would have been disturbing. Once he woke to complete silence. No wind, no ice sounds, no breathing that he could detect. The panic was immediate and overwhelming until his eyes adjusted and he could see the shapes of the other men, could hear Thomas's faint snoring, could orient himself back into reality. His body had changed over the winter. His hands were scarred and calloused, his face weathered, his movements slower but more efficient. He had learned to conserve energy without thinking about it, to move only when movement was necessary. When he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a pan of water, he didn't recognize himself. His face had thinned dramatically, his cheekbones prominent, his eyes receded into dark hollows. By April, patches of ground began to appear where the snow had melted. The sight should have been encouraging, but Jean-Baptiste felt nothing, not relief, not joy, just a vague awareness that the season was changing. The first bird songs in months should have lifted his spirits, but they sounded alien and intrusive after the long silence. He had grown accustomed to the muffled quiet of deep winter, and the returning sounds of spring felt like an assault. They began preparing for departure, sorting pelts, repairing the canoes that had been stored under snow, calculating how many trips it would take to transport everything downstream. The work was familiar now, just another set of tasks to be completed. The pelts they had accumulated numbered in the hundreds, beaver primarily, but also marten, fox, a few otter. Each one represented hours of work, miles walked, cold endured. Each one would be sold for a price that Jean-Baptiste suspected wouldn't come close to compensating for what they had given up to obtain them. The last night in camp felt no different from the others. They sat around the fire, eating their evening meal, speaking only when necessary. The meal was pemmican, the same food they had eaten for months, and Jean-Baptiste's body accepted it without interest or pleasure. Food had become pure fuel, nothing more. Jean-Baptiste looked at the shelter that had been his home for 5 months, at the fire pit they had maintained through countless nights, at the surrounding forest that had witnessed their quiet struggle. He felt no attachment to any of it, no sentiment. This place had served its purpose. Now it would be abandoned, left to collapse under future snows, forgotten. The shelter would last perhaps 2 or 3 more winters before the weight of snow crushed the roof, before rot claimed the logs, before the forest reclaimed the small clearing they had made. No trace of their presence would remain. They left at dawn, loading the canoes, pushing off into water that was so cold it made Jean-Baptiste's hands ache just from touching the paddle. The camp disappeared behind them, swallowed by distance and forest. The current carried them faster than they could have paddled, the river swollen with snowmelt. Jean-Baptiste watched the shoreline blur past and felt a detachment so complete that he might have been observing someone else's life. Jean-Baptiste never returned to that particular valley, though he spent many more winters in similar camps. Each one blurred into the next, the same cold, the same shelters, the same long nights of waiting. 11 more winters he worked for the fur companies, moving from camp to camp, valley to valley. He learned the rivers and the trap lines, learned which camps were productive and which were cursed by poor location or bad luck. He became like Moreau eventually, weathered and quiet, capable of enduring without visible effort. When younger men joined the camps, he watched them with the same assessing gaze he had once received, noting who adapted and who struggled. Some of the young men reminded him of himself, nervous, uncertain, trying too hard to prove themselves. Others were different, already hardened by previous hardships, arriving at the camps with the knowledge that this was just another form of suffering to be endured. He rarely thought about his first winter, about the man who had died, about the terror he had felt during those early nights. Moreau had been right. The details faded, leaving only the knowledge that he had survived. Philippe's face had become indistinct in memory, merged with the faces of other men who had died in other camps during other winters. Death became ordinary, Unremarkable, just another aspect of the work. Years later, after he had finally left the fur trade and settled in a town whose name he had once promised himself he would never forget, someone asked him what the winters had been like. Jean-Baptiste considered the question, searching for words that might convey something true. The person who asked was a young clerk born in the town whose most difficult hardship had been a shortage of firewood one particularly cold week. He was curious but not genuinely interested, asking only to make conversation. "Cold," he said finally. "They were very cold." It wasn't enough, but it was all he could offer. The real answer would have required explaining the particular quality of darkness in a winter camp, the weight of silence, the strange intimacy of sharing misery with strangers, the way time stretched and contracted until days became indistinguishable from each other. It would have required explaining that survival wasn't heroic or noble, just tedious and necessary. That bravery wasn't required, only endurance. That the nights didn't build character so much as they simply had to be gotten through, one after another, until finally they ended. The clerk would have listened politely, perhaps even with apparent interest, but he would not have understood. Understanding required experience, and no amount of description could substitute for the actual sensation of believing you might not survive the night. But these weren't things that could be explained to someone who hadn't experienced them. So Jean-Baptiste said nothing more, and the person who had asked eventually moved on to other topics, satisfied with the answer they had received. Jean-Baptiste felt no resentment about this. The clerk lived in a different world, one where cold was an inconvenience rather than a threat, where darkness ended when you lit a lamp, where comfort was available at modest expense. The winters faded further into memory, becoming less distinct, less present. Jean-Baptiste's body remembered what his mind forgot. His hands still ached in cold weather. His sleep remained light and easily broken. He still woke sometimes in the deepest part of night and listened for sounds he could no longer name. Even in his bed, in his house with its reliable stove and thick walls, he sometimes woke reaching for wood to feed a fire that didn't exist. The motion was automatic, performed before full consciousness returned. These were the traces that remained, the small permanent changes that winter camps had carved into him. They weren't dramatic or visible, just quiet alterations in the way he moved through the world. He couldn't sit with his back to a door, needed to know where the exits were in any room, felt uneasy in spaces that were too warm or too comfortable. These quirks marked him as different, though most people attributed them to age or temperament rather than experience. In his final years, when his body had grown frail and his memories had begun to blur into each other, he sometimes dreamed of the camps. Not the specific camps or specific nights, but rather the feeling of them, the waiting, the cold, the darkness that never quite lifted. The dreams were not nightmares exactly, though they weren't pleasant. They were simply memories replaying themselves, his mind returning to those months when existence had been reduced to its most basic elements. He would wake from these dreams not with fear, but with a strange nostalgia, as if missing something he had never enjoyed. Perhaps he missed his younger self, the one who had survived those winters. Or perhaps he simply missed the clarity of having only one task, to last until morning. Life in the town had become complicated in ways that winter camps never were. There were social obligations, financial concerns, relationships that required maintenance and attention. Sometimes Jean-Baptiste longed for the simplicity of cold and darkness and survival. Jean-Baptiste Larocque died in 1847 in a bed in a room with a fire that never went out, surrounded by people who had never known true cold. His last thoughts, if he had any that were coherent, have not been recorded. The people around his deathbed spoke of his soul going to heaven, of reuniting with loved ones who had passed before. Jean-Baptiste, if he heard these words, gave no sign of agreement or disagreement. He was buried in a cemetery with a stone that listed his name and dates, nothing more. There was no mention of the winters, of the camps, of the nights he had endured. The stone read simply, Jean-Baptiste Larocque, 1770–1847. His occupation was not listed, nor any indication of how he had spent the prime years of his life. To anyone reading the stone, he was just another name, another set of dates, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other markers in the cemetery. Those things belonged to a life that had left no permanent record except in the bodies and memories of men who, like him, eventually died and took their stories with them. The camps themselves had long since rotted and collapsed, reclaimed by the forests they had briefly interrupted. Somewhere in the wilderness west of Lake Superior, buried under decades of accumulated leaves and soil, were the remains of shelters where men had huddled against the cold. Archaeologists might find them someday, might excavate the fire pits and debris, might write papers about the fur trade and the men who sustained it, but they would never recover the experience itself. And yet something of those nights persists, not in monuments or histories, but in the simple fact that they happened. Men sat in cold shelters, tended fires, waited for dawn, and survived. The fact of their survival changed nothing about the world, accomplished nothing that history would remember, but it happened nonetheless. They endured because they had no choice but to endure. Their survival required no special talent, no great courage, just the willingness to endure one more night, and then another, until finally the ice broke and they could leave. It's a small thing, perhaps, but it's enough. The measure of a life, Jean-Baptiste might have said if anyone had asked, wasn't in what you accomplished, but in what you managed to survive. And he had survived winters that would have killed lesser men, or perhaps just less fortunate ones. The rhythm of their nights continues in some way, echoing forward into our own time, a reminder that darkness and cold were once obstacles that required all of a person's attention and effort to overcome. We've forgotten that struggle mostly, but it happened. We live in heated rooms, complain about minor discomforts, never wonder whether we'll survive the night. The distance between our lives and Jean-Baptiste's is measured not in years, but in the fundamental transformation of human existence. And men like Jean-Baptiste, unremarkable men whose names appear in no important documents, whose lives changed nothing significant, who simply worked and endured and eventually died, they were there. They sat in the darkness, they tended the fires, they waited for morning. They were the foundation upon which our comfort was built, though we rarely acknowledge it. The furs they trapped clothed people in distant cities who never thought about where the pelts came from or who had suffered to obtain them. That's all, but somehow it's everything. The winters continue even now, though we experience them through glass and insulation. Somewhere, perhaps, a similar story is unfolding. Different circumstances, different details, but the same essential truth, that human endurance is both more fragile and more persistent than we imagine. Jean-Baptiste Larocque's story ends, as all stories must, in silence and forgetting. But for a moment, suspended in these words, the camps return, the fire, the cold, the darkness, the waiting. And Jean-Baptiste sits there still, feeding the flames, listening to the ice, counting the hours until dawn. There is a curious gap in the historical record when it comes to winter camps and their relationship with darkness. The journals that survive speak of practical matters, pelts counted, weather noted, supplies inventoried, but they rarely mention the night itself. This silence is not accidental. It suggests something about how those men understood the hours after sunset, an understanding that was perhaps too obvious to record or too uncomfortable to acknowledge. When we examine the physical remains of frontier winter camps, certain patterns emerge. The archaeological sites scattered across river valleys and forest clearings from Quebec to Oregon reveal choices that had nothing to do with efficiency or convenience. These were choices made by men who feared something, though what exactly they feared is less clear. The night itself, perhaps, or what the night might contain. Consider the positioning of shelters. In camps where multiple structures existed, they were almost never scattered randomly across the available space. Instead, they clustered together, often in configurations that seemed defensive, backs to natural barriers like cliff faces or dense tree growth, openings facing inward toward shared fire pits. These arrangements sacrificed practical benefits like privacy and air circulation for something else. The fire pits themselves tell their own story. In excavated campsites, archaeologists find not one fire pit but many, layered on top of each other like sediment. The same location was used repeatedly, rebuilt after each use, the stones scorched and re-scorched until they cracked from repeated heating. This suggests that fire location mattered deeply, that once a spot was chosen, it was maintained with something close to ritual consistency. Around these fire pits, the ground shows signs of compressed earth in circular patterns. Men sat in the same positions night after night, wearing grooves into the frozen soil through repetition. The consistency of these patterns across different camps, separated by hundreds of miles and decades of time, implies shared practices, shared beliefs about how night should be managed. But the journals mention none of this directly. What they do mention, occasionally, are the practices themselves stripped of explanation. A voyageur's diary from 1802 notes in passing that someone sat watch through the night, rotating every few hours. Another journal from 1819 mentions keeping the fire burning continuously, as if this were unusual enough to warrant comment. A letter from 1834 describes a man who refused to sleep with his back to the shelter opening, though the writer offers no reason why. These fragments hint at a larger structure of belief and practice that was so commonplace it needed no explanation. Everyone knew that you kept the fire burning. Everyone understood the watch rotation. Everyone knew which direction to face while sleeping. The knowledge was transmitted through observation and participation, not through instruction. You learned by watching what the experienced men did, and you imitated them until the practices became your own. But what were they watching for? The practical answer would be animals, wolves, bears, mountain lions, or human threats from rival trading parties or hostile encounters. Yet the archaeological evidence suggests something more ambiguous. Camps were established in locations that were already relatively safe from predators, in areas where human conflict was unlikely. The defensive positioning of shelters seems designed less to prevent a specific threat than to manage a general anxiety. The night was dangerous not because of what it contained, but because of what it might contain, because of what couldn't be seen or predicted. Indigenous peoples who interacted with these frontier camps had their own complex relationships with darkness, relationships that the European and American traders imperfectly understood. Many indigenous cultures had specific protocols for night, times to travel and times to remain still, places that were safe after dark and places that were not. These weren't superstitions in the way the traders understood superstition. They were practical knowledge accumulated over generations, codified into cultural practice. The traders, separated from their own cultural contexts and living in territories they didn't fully understand, borrowed fragments of this knowledge without grasping its full meaning. They learned that certain practices increased survival, keeping fires burning, sleeping in groups, maintaining watch, but they didn't necessarily understand why these practices worked. Over time, the practices became divorced from their origins, becoming tradition rather than reason. You kept the fire burning not because of any specific threat, but because that's what was done, because every man before you had done it, because not doing it felt dangerous even if you couldn't articulate the danger. This transformation of practical knowledge into ritual observance happened slowly across many winters and many camps. By the 1840s, when a young man joined his first winter camp, he inherited practices whose purposes had been forgotten. He learned to arrange his sleeping space a certain way, to position his tools within reach, to wake at certain intervals, to listen for certain sounds. These actions became automatic, part of the muscle memory of winter survival. The tools themselves carried traces of this anxiety. Knives, axes, and rifles were kept close at hand during sleep, often within the sleeping space itself, despite the obvious discomfort this caused. Excavations of abandoned camps reveal these objects still clustered near where men would have slept, left behind when the camps were evacuated. Their placement suggests they were positioned for quick access, for defensive response to threat, though historical records document very few actual attacks on winter camps. The gap between preparation and actual danger is revealing. Men prepared for threats that rarely materialized, maintained vigilance against attacks that seldom came, organized their entire sleeping arrangement around a danger that was mostly theoretical. This suggests the real threat was psychological rather than physical, not attack, but the fear of attack, not danger, but the possibility of danger, not the night itself, but the uncertainty it represented. Darkness removed certainty, and humans have always struggled with uncertainty. Some camps developed specific rituals around the transition from day to night. A journal entry from 1826 describes a practice of walking the camp's perimeter before settling in for the night, checking traps and equipment one final time, even though they had already been checked hours earlier. Another account mentions a moment of silence before the fire was banked for the night, though what this silence commemorated or acknowledged is never stated. These small ceremonies served to mark the boundary between day and night, creating a psychological transition that matched the physical one. The objects men brought to winter camps reveal their concerns. Beyond the practical tools required for trapping and survival, personal items show a pattern. Religious medals, carved tokens, small bags containing herbs or other substances, these appear frequently in archaeological contexts, often worn close to the body. They suggest a belief in protection, in the efficacy of certain objects to ward off harm or bring luck. Whether the men who carried these items truly believed in their power or simply found comfort in their presence is impossible to determine. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. Comfort itself becomes a form of protection when you're facing months of darkness and cold. The question of what men believed about night cannot be fully separated from what night actually was in those contexts. Without artificial light beyond fire, darkness was absolute in ways modern people rarely experience. The world beyond the fire's reach didn't just become dim, it disappeared entirely. A person standing 20 feet away was invisible. Sounds became amplified, distorted, impossible to accurately locate. The wind through trees could sound like footsteps, the settling of snow could mimic voices, the crack of freezing timber could suggest approaching danger. This absolute darkness created conditions where belief and reality became difficult to distinguish. A sound in the night might be wind, or an animal, or another person, or nothing at all. There was no way to know without investigation, and investigation meant leaving the safety of the fire and shelter. More often, sounds were simply noted and then ignored, filed away as part of the ambient noise of night. Over time, men learned which sounds required response and which could be dismissed, building a mental catalogue of safe and dangerous noises. But this learning was imperfect, based on limited experience and incomplete information. Every winter brought sounds that didn't fit the catalogue, ambiguous events that might have been threatening or might have been nothing. These ambiguities accumulated, creating an ongoing state of low-level alertness that never fully resolved. You couldn't know that you were safe, you could only know that you had survived another night, that whatever sounds you heard hadn't resulted in actual harm. This distinction is crucial. Survival proved you had been safe in retrospect, but it offered no guarantee about the future. The next night might be different. The sounds you ignored tonight might be worth investigating tomorrow. The practices that kept you alive so far might fail at any moment. The fire might go out, the watch might fall asleep. The defenses might prove inadequate against some threat you hadn't anticipated. This uncertainty created a form of vigilance that wasn't dramatic or acute, but rather chronic and persistent. You didn't watch for specific threats. You maintained a general state of readiness, a background awareness that never completely turned off. Physical evidence suggests this vigilance affected sleep patterns. When camps are excavated, sleeping spaces show signs of frequent disturbance, the ground compressed unevenly, suggesting restless movement rather than still rest. Modern sleep researchers would recognize the pattern as fragmented sleep, the kind that leaves you tired even after a full night. But frontier winter camps offered no alternative. You slept as well as the conditions allowed, which was never well enough. Some historians have suggested that alcohol played a role in managing night anxiety, and certainly many winter camps maintained supplies of rum or whiskey. But the journals suggest this was less common than we might imagine. Alcohol required warmth to be tolerable, and warmth was scarce. More practically, alcohol impaired the judgment and reflexes that survival required. Men who drank heavily in winter camps rarely lasted long, and their fates served as warnings to others. Stories circulated of trappers who numbed themselves against the cold and fear, only to freeze to death within feet of their shelters or to respond too slowly when actual danger arrived. Instead, the primary coping mechanism was simply endurance, accepting that night would be uncomfortable, that sleep would be poor, that vigilance would be constant, and that this was the price of survival. No ceremony or belief could change these basic facts, so belief adapted itself to reality rather than attempting to transform it. The mystery, then, is not what winter camps believed about night, but why those beliefs left so few traces in the written record. The silence suggests something considered too ordinary to mention, or perhaps too private. Night was experienced individually even when shared communally. Each man lay awake with his own thoughts, his own fears, his own memories and anticipations. What happened in those private hours of darkness was both universal. Everyone was cold, everyone was vigilant, everyone waited for morning, and completely individual. Your night was like everyone else's night, but also entirely your own. This private experience resisted documentation. You might record the temperature, the weather, the day's work, but how do you record the quality of darkness, the weight of silence, the particular texture of your own anxiety? These things were felt, but not easily described, experienced, but not easily shared. They belonged to the realm of sensation rather than fact, and facts were what journals documented. So the nights passed mostly unrecorded, leaving us with archaeological fragments and brief journal entries, puzzle pieces that hint at a larger picture without quite revealing it. We can see that men positioned their shelters defensively, that they kept tools close, that they maintained fires obsessively. We can infer that night was something to be managed, prepared for, endured. But the actual experience, what it felt like to lie in darkness, listening to sounds you couldn't identify, waiting for a dawn that seemed impossibly far away, remains mostly inaccessible. Perhaps that inaccessibility is itself meaningful. Perhaps the silence in the historical record reflects the fact that night, particularly winter night in a frontier camp, was an experience that resisted language. It was too ordinary to be remarkable and too uncomfortable to be dwelled upon. It simply was a fact of life, like cold or hunger, something you lived through without comment, because comment would not change it. And yet men developed practices, maintained rituals, created small ceremonies around this experience. They did something with their fear and uncertainty, even if they didn't write it down. They passed their knowledge to younger men through demonstration rather than explanation. They made choices about where to sleep, how to arrange their space, when to wake, what to listen for. These choices accumulated into culture, into shared practice, into tradition. The tradition survived even after the camps themselves were abandoned, carried forward by men who went on to establish towns and farms and permanent settlements. You can see traces of it in how frontier houses were built, certain orientations favored, certain architectural features repeated, certain practices maintained. The anxiety of winter camp nights left its mark on American and Canadian frontier culture, shaping behavior in ways that outlasted memory. People who had never spent a night in a winter camp nonetheless inherited the practices developed by those who had. The fear diluted across generations, becoming caution, becoming preference, becoming habit, until finally it disappeared entirely, leaving only the behaviors themselves stripped of their original context. And now those behaviors too have mostly vanished, replaced by technologies that have defeated darkness and cold. We have lights that banish night, heating that eliminates winter's worst effects, communication devices that prevent isolation. The experience of absolute darkness, of vulnerability, of waiting through long hours for dawn, these have become rare enough to be almost theoretical. We know they happened, we can document the practices people developed in response, but we cannot quite imagine what they felt like. This gap in understanding is perhaps unbridgeable. The past is not just a different place, but a different sensory reality, and that reality becomes more foreign with each passing generation. What we're left with are traces, scorched stones, compressed earth, tool fragments, and occasional journal entries that hint at experience without quite capturing it. These traces suggest that winter camp nights were significant, that they required management and attention and belief. They tell us that men were afraid, though afraid of what exactly remains unclear. They tell us that darkness mattered, that night was not merely the absence of day, but rather its own presence, something that had to be confronted and survived. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps knowing that men struggled with something, even if we can't fully understand what or why, is sufficient to honor their experience. Yet the question persists. What exactly was the nature of their struggle? The archaeological record offers additional clues when examined more closely. Consider the distribution of camps across the landscape. While many were positioned near water sources and game trails, as practical necessity demanded, their precise locations within those areas show a curious selectivity. Camps were rarely established in low-lying areas, even when such locations would have offered better protection from wind. Instead, men chose slightly elevated positions, places where they could see approaches even in dim light. This preference appears across diverse geographic regions: the boreal forests of Quebec, the prairie edges of Manitoba, the mountain valleys of Montana. The consistency suggests not local tradition, but a shared instinct, something men arrived at independently because the logic was inescapable. Height meant visibility, and visibility meant time to prepare for whatever might come. Even a few extra seconds of warning could make the difference between survival and disaster, or so the thinking went. But visibility worked both ways. A camp positioned for observation was also more visible to others, more exposed to any eyes that might be watching from the darkness beyond the fire. This created a tension that men navigated differently depending on their circumstances. Some camps show evidence of deliberate concealment, shelters built into hillsides or beneath overhanging rock formations, fires maintained at levels that provided warmth without excessive light. Other camps seem almost defiant in their visibility, as if daring any potential threat to approach. These camps typically belong to larger groups, parties of 8 or 10 men, who found security in numbers rather than concealment. The size of a winter camp profoundly influenced how its inhabitants experienced night. A solitary trapper faced darkness alone, with no one to share the watch, no voice to break the silence, no reassurance that someone else was awake and alert. Solo camps showed different patterns in the archaeological record. Smaller fire pits used more intensively, suggesting fires that burned hotter and more continuously. The sleeping spaces in these camps are often positioned immediately adjacent to the fire, sacrificing comfort for proximity to light and warmth. Personal accounts from solitary trappers, rare as they are, convey a different quality of night experience. One diary entry from 1807 describes a man talking to himself through the dark hours, maintaining a running monologue as if conversation alone could hold back the silence. Another journal mentions a trapper who kept a dog not for hunting or protection, but for companionship, for the sound of another living thing breathing in the darkness. The dog died midwinter, and the man abandoned his camp weeks before the planned departure, unable to face the remaining nights alone. These extreme cases highlight what group camps manage to diffuse, the psychological weight of isolation. In a camp of multiple men, the burden of night was shared, distributed across several consciousnesses so that no single person bore its full weight. The watch rotation, mentioned briefly in various journals, served this function as much as any practical security purpose. Knowing that someone else would take over, that you would eventually be relieved, made the dark hours more endurable. But the rotation also meant that everyone took a turn alone with the night. For those hours when you kept watch while others slept, you became the solitary figure, the single consciousness standing between the camp and whatever lay beyond the firelight. Journal entries from men on watch describe a heightened state of awareness, a sharpening of senses that felt almost supernatural. Colors seemed more vivid in the firelight, sounds became clearer and more distinct, even the quality of the air seemed to change. Some of this was simply the body's natural response to alertness and adrenaline. But some of it may have been genuine, eyes adapting more fully to darkness, ears straining to catch sounds normally missed, the mind processing information with the desperate clarity that comes from knowing lives might depend on it. The transition between day work and night watch was not instant. Men needed time to adjust, to shift from the mindset of labor to the mindset of vigilance. Some camps developed elaborate preparation rituals for the watch. A journal from 1823 describes men washing their faces with snow before taking their turn, the shock of cold supposedly helping to maintain alertness. Another account mentions the practice of eating a small amount before watch duty, not enough to induce drowsiness, but enough to provide fuel for the long hours ahead. Some men walked the camp perimeter several times before settling into position, warming their muscles and checking the familiar landmarks that would become reference points in the darkness. These preparations were partly practical and partly psychological, ways of mentally transitioning from one state to another. The watch required a different kind of attention than trapping or skinning or camp maintenance, less focused but more sustained, less active but more intense. Men had to remain still enough to hear clearly but alert enough to respond instantly if needed. They had to distinguish between sounds that mattered and sounds that didn't, between movement that indicated threat and movement that was simply the natural stirring of the forest. This was a learned skill acquired through experience and refined through repetition. Young men on their first winter often struggled with it, jumping at every sound, exhausting themselves with false alarms. Experienced trappers learned a kind of relaxed alertness, a state where they were simultaneously resting and vigilant. They could sit motionless for hours, appearing half asleep, yet respond instantly to any sound or movement that fell outside the expected pattern. This skill was valuable enough that men with it were sought after for winter camps. Company records occasionally note a trapper's ability to keep good watch, a phrase that seems to indicate not just staying awake, but maintaining effective vigilance. What made some men better at this than others is unclear. Natural temperament likely played a role. Some people are simply more comfortable with darkness and isolation than others. But experience mattered too, and not just experience with winter camps specifically. Men who had served in military campaigns, who had hunted extensively, who had spent time at sea, these men often adapted more easily to the demands of night watch. They had already learned to function in conditions of uncertainty and potential danger. They had already developed the psychological tools needed to manage fear without being paralyzed by it. Fear was the constant companion of winter camp nights, but it came in different varieties. There was the acute fear of immediate danger, a sound too close, a shadow that shouldn't be there, a moment when something felt decisively wrong. This kind of fear was relatively rare, sharp and brief. It triggered action, grabbing a weapon, waking others, investigating or preparing to defend. More common was a chronic, low-grade anxiety that had no specific object, that simply pervaded the dark hours like smoke from the fire. This was harder to manage because it couldn't be resolved through action. You couldn't fight it or flee from it. You could only endure it, breathing through it, reminding yourself that you had survived previous nights and would likely survive this one too. Some men developed personal techniques for managing this ambient anxiety. A letter from 1829 describes a trapper who recited poetry during his watch, working through every verse he could remember as a way of occupying his mind. Another account mentions a man who carved small figures from wood, his hands occupied even as his eyes and ears remained alert. These activities served as anchors, concrete tasks that prevented the mind from spiraling into darker territories. Because the mind, left idle in darkness, tends toward dark thoughts. Isolation and night have a way of amplifying regrets, of bringing forward memories you might prefer to forget, of creating space for fears and doubts that daylight normally keeps at bay. Men thought about families left behind, about decisions that had led them to this particular place and time, about the possibility that they might not survive the winter to see those families again. They thought about comrades who had died in previous seasons, about camps that had failed, about all the ways things could go catastrophically wrong. These thoughts were not typically recorded in journals. They were too personal, too painful, too likely to be dismissed as weakness by anyone who might later read the entries. But they were real, and they were shared. In the rare moments when men did speak about their night experiences, these thoughts came through. The loneliness, the doubt, the quiet terror of being so far from anything familiar or safe. A particularly revealing account comes from a French-Canadian voyageur whose journal was discovered in the 1960s, its pages water-damaged but largely legible. He wrote extensively about night, perhaps because French allowed him an emotional directness that English-language journals of the period typically avoided. He described the darkness as something alive, something that pressed against the fire's light like a physical force. He wrote about the sensation of being watched, though he never saw anyone watching, about feeling that the forest itself was aware of the camp's presence and resented it. These descriptions could be dismissed as superstition or poetic license, but they capture something that appears more subtly in other accounts, a sense that the night was not neutral, that it had its own character and presence. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, but rather a presence in itself, something that existed independently of what it concealed. This phenomenological reality of darkness shaped how men responded to it. You couldn't reason with darkness or negotiate with it or understand it in any conventional sense. You could only acknowledge it, prepare for it, and wait for it to pass. The practices that developed around this, the fire maintenance, the watch rotation, the defensive positioning, were responses not to specific threats, but to this larger, more diffuse sense of presence. Anthropologists studying indigenous cultures in similar environments have documented comparable responses to darkness, suggesting that the traders' experiences weren't unique, but rather typical of humans in those conditions. When night comes early and stays late, when darkness is absolute and isolation complete, certain psychological patterns emerge regardless of cultural background. The difference was that indigenous peoples had generations of accumulated wisdom about managing these patterns, cultural frameworks that made sense of the experience and provided context for it. The trappers and traders lacked this framework or had fragments of it from their own cultural backgrounds that didn't quite apply in this new environment. They were improvising, creating practices through trial and error, borrowing from indigenous knowledge where they could, but often misunderstanding or misapplying it. What emerged was a hybrid approach, neither fully European nor fully indigenous, adapted to their specific circumstances. This cultural improvisation is visible in the archaeological record through objects that don't quite fit either tradition. European tools modified in ways that reflect indigenous techniques, indigenous items incorporated into European systems, combinations that would have seemed strange in either culture's original context. The winter camps were sites of cultural mixing, though not the deliberate, thoughtful kind that produces synthesis. Rather, it was desperate mixing, the kind that happens when people need to survive and will try anything that might help. If indigenous peoples said that certain trees were unlucky to camp near, the traders avoided those trees even if they didn't understand why. If a particular arrangement of stones seemed to keep fires burning better, that arrangement was replicated, even if the reasoning behind it was unclear. Knowledge was adopted pragmatically, evaluated by whether it worked rather than whether it made sense within any existing framework. Over the decades, this pragmatic accumulation of practices created a distinct winter camp culture, a set of shared norms and behaviors that transcended individual companies or specific regions. Men who had never met nonetheless followed similar routines, made similar choices, prepared for night in similar ways. This cultural convergence was driven partly by communication. Trappers from different camps would meet at trading posts and exchange information about what worked and what didn't. But it was also driven by the logic of the situation itself, by the fact that certain problems only have so many viable solutions. If you need to survive a winter night in a remote camp, your options are limited. You keep fire, you maintain watch, you position shelter defensively, you keep weapons close. The specific details might vary, but the general pattern is nearly inevitable. Evolution works this way too. Different species in similar environments develop similar features, not because they're related, but because those features solve common problems. Winter camp culture evolved through a similar process, shaped by environmental pressures into forms that worked regardless of who implemented them. And those forms left physical traces that archaeologists can still recover centuries later. But what they cannot recover is the subjective experience, the felt sense of what it was like. No arrangement of artifacts can fully convey the texture of a winter night, the way cold seeped through every layer of clothing, the way darkness seemed to have weight and substance. Modern people who attempt to recreate these experiences, historians who spend nights in reconstructed camps, researchers who try to understand through direct experience, inevitably fail to capture the full reality. They know they can leave, that rescue is available, that the experience is temporary and voluntary. The men in actual winter camps knew none of these things. For them, there was no leaving until spring made travel possible, no rescue if things went wrong, no end in sight to the succession of dark night. This knowledge, that they were genuinely isolated, genuinely at risk, genuinely dependent on their own resources, colored everything. It turned manageable discomfort into existential challenge, routine vigilance into a matter of survival. And it was this knowledge, more than the physical conditions themselves, that created the psychological atmosphere of winter camp nights. The cold could be endured, the darkness navigated, the isolation managed. But the knowledge that failure meant death, that one mistake could be fatal, that there was no margin for error, that was what made the nights so difficult. Some men adapted to this better than others, Company records occasionally note trappers who seemed to thrive in winter camps, who volunteered for the longest and most isolated postings, who apparently felt more comfortable in the wilderness than in settlements. These men were valuable but also somewhat mysterious to their contemporaries. What made someone prefer isolation to company, darkness to light, risk to security? The journals rarely explore this question directly, but it surfaces in small ways, in the tone used to describe certain trappers, in the mix of respect and unease that colors references to men who seemed too comfortable in the camps. There was something unsettling about people who didn't find the nights difficult, who seemed to belong to the darkness in ways that normal men did not. Whether these men actually found the nights easy or simply hid their struggles more effectively is impossible to know. Perhaps they had learned to reframe the experience, to find something in the isolation and darkness that others missed. Or perhaps they were simply better at denial, at suppressing awareness of danger and discomfort, until it became background noise they no longer consciously noticed. Either way, they served as models for younger trappers, examples of what was possible, proof that winter camps could be survived. And they did survive them most years. Most men made it through to spring, collected their pay, and returned to do it again. The fact that they returned is itself significant. Despite the hardship, despite the fear, despite the long, dark nights, they came back. Some came back because they had no better options, because the fur trade offered income they couldn't find elsewhere. But others came back voluntarily, choosing the camps over alternatives that would have been easier and safer. This suggests that the experience, difficult as it was, offered something valuable, perhaps a sense of accomplishment, of having tested oneself against genuine hardship and prevailed. Perhaps a kind of clarity that came from being stripped of everything inessential, from facing existence in its most basic form. Or perhaps simply the recognition that having survived once, you could survive again, that you possessed capabilities you hadn't known you had. The camps revealed men to themselves, showed them what they were capable of enduring, what they could adapt to and persist through. This self-knowledge was a kind of wealth, different from the money earned through pelts, but valuable in its own way. Men who survived winter camps knew something about themselves that men who stayed in settlements could never know. They knew how much they could bear before breaking, and they knew that the breaking point was further away than they had imagined. This knowledge changed them in ways that persisted long after the camps themselves. You can see it in the historical record, in the later lives of men who spent winters in the wilderness. They tended to be less fearful of hardship, more willing to take risks, more confident in their ability to handle difficulty. They had, in a sense, already faced the worst that life could offer and found that they could survive it. The nights had taught them something that couldn't be learned any other way, something about darkness and endurance and the strange resilience of human consciousness. They had learned that fear could be lived with, that comfort was optional, that much of what seemed necessary for happiness was actually expendable. These were hard lessons, purchased at great cost. Some men paid with their physical health. Winters in the camps left them with chronic ailments, with lungs damaged by smoke and cold, with joints worn out by the constant struggle against weather. Others paid with their mental health, emerging from the camps changed in ways that made it difficult to reintegrate into normal society. They couldn't explain what the nights had been like, couldn't convey what they had experienced, couldn't find words for the things they had learned. So they stayed silent, carrying their knowledge privately, and the historical record stayed silent with them. The nights remained mostly undocumented, preserved only in the physical traces they left behind, the arranged stones, the compressed earth, the carefully positioned tools. These traces speak of fear and preparation, of vigilance and ritual, of men doing their best to manage something that couldn't be fully controlled. They speak of a relationship with darkness that modern people have largely forgotten, a relationship that was immediate and urgent and impossible to ignore. And they remind us that the past was not just different in its facts, but in its fundamental conditions of existence, in the sensory and psychological reality that shaped how people experienced the world. The nights that frontier trappers lived through were not like our nights. They were darker, colder, longer, more threatening, more real in some essential way. Understanding this doesn't require us to romanticize the past or to wish we could return to it. It simply requires acknowledging that human experience has changed profoundly, that technologies and social structures have transformed not just what we do, but how we feel, what we fear, how we understand safety and danger. The winter camps stand as markers of this transformation, archaeological sites that preserve a moment when humans still lived in intimate relationship with darkness, when night was not a convenience to be overcome, but a force to be reckoned with. The men who inhabited those camps developed a sophisticated culture around managing this relationship, a culture that has now almost entirely disappeared. What remains are fragments, enough to suggest the existence of something significant, not enough to fully recreate it. We can see that men were afraid, that they developed practices to manage their fear, that these practices worked well enough to allow survival. We can see that night mattered to them in ways it no longer matters to us, that darkness was a presence in their lives that shaped their behavior and their beliefs. We can see that they struggled with something we can barely imagine, and that they developed a kind of wisdom about it that has been lost. And perhaps that's sufficient. Perhaps it's enough to know that the struggle happened, that men lived through it, that they passed their knowledge forward, even if we can no longer fully access that knowledge. The nights happened. Men watched through them, waited through them, survived them. And then morning came and came again and continued coming until eventually the winters ended and the camps were abandoned and the practices forgotten. But for a time, in camps scattered across the frontier, men maintained their vigil, kept their fires burning, and made it through the darkness to see another dawn. The mystery endures not because evidence is missing, but because experience itself is impossible to fully transmit across time. The nights happened. Men lived through them. And then they ended. Not everyone who spent winters on the frontier endured the same darkness. While trappers and laborers huddled in canvas shelters, others lived behind thicker walls under more substantial roofs, with systems and hierarchies that transformed night from threat into mere inconvenience. The trading posts that dotted the frontier represented a different relationship with winter entirely. These structures were built to last multiple seasons, constructed from logs chinked with moss and mud, with roofs designed to shed snow rather than collapse beneath it. Inside, the architecture itself reflected permanence and planning. Multiple rooms allowed for the separation of functions, storage, sleeping quarters, common areas, each space dedicated to a specific purpose rather than forced to serve multiple needs simultaneously. The factor who managed such a post, typically a senior employee of whatever trading company claimed the territory, occupied quarters that would have seemed palatial to men in winter camps. A private room with a door that closed, a bed raised off the ground, perhaps even a small stove rather than an open fire pit. These weren't luxuries in the way we might understand luxury today. They were simply protections against the elements, basic architectural solutions to the problem of winter that money and organization could purchase. But in the context of the frontier, where most men slept on frozen ground beside smoky fires, such protections represented an enormous gulf in comfort and safety. The factor went to bed with reasonable confidence that he would wake in the morning warm and unharmed. His night was structured differently from the beginning. Before retiring, he might review inventory records by candlelight or write correspondence to be carried downstream when travel resumed, or plan the next season's operations. These activities required a mind that was not consumed with immediate survival, attention that could be directed toward future concerns rather than present dangers. The luxury of thinking beyond tonight was perhaps the greatest privilege of all. The candlelight itself represented a form of wealth that men in winter camps could rarely afford. Candles meant fat or wax set aside for illumination rather than nutrition or waterproofing, meant resources abundant enough that some could be dedicated to comfort rather than pure survival. The factor's ability to read and write in evening hours extended his productive day beyond what sunlight permitted. While men in camps surrendered to darkness when daylight failed, he continued working, planning, corresponding with a world beyond the immediate circle of firelight. This extension of consciousness into the night hours accumulated advantages over time. More planning meant better decisions. More correspondence meant stronger networks. More reading meant accumulated knowledge that could be applied to future challenges. When darkness fell, the trading post transformed but did not surrender. Guards were posted at regular intervals, men whose specific duty was vigilance so that others could rest. This formalization of watchkeeping represented a fundamental shift from the improvised rotations of winter camps. In the post, responsibility was assigned and rotated according to schedule rather than necessity or exhaustion. The guards themselves experienced night differently than those they protected. They stood their watch in designated positions, often with sheltered posts that blocked wind while maintaining sight lines. They were supplied with additional clothing, with refreshments at intervals, with the knowledge that their watch would end at a specified time and they would be relieved. Their vigilance was bounded, finite, contained within a system. The psychology of bounded duty differed fundamentally from the endless vigilance required in winter camps. A guard knew that in 4 hours or 6, someone would arrive to take his place, that he could then retreat to warmth and genuine rest. This certainty made the present discomfort bearable in ways that endless, indefinite vigilance never could be. The mind could endure cold and darkness more easily when it knew both had a scheduled end point. For the factor sleeping in his quarters, the presence of these guards meant something profound, the ability to fully sleep. Not the fragmented, restless sleep of winter camps, but actual sustained unconsciousness. The mind could release its background awareness, its constant monitoring for threat, because that monitoring had been delegated to others. This delegation was perhaps the defining characteristic of institutional protection. The quality of sleep itself became a marker of social position. Those who could afford to sleep deeply woke more rested, more capable of complex thought, more resilient to the accumulated stresses of winter. Those who could never fully sleep accumulated a deficit of rest that compounded over weeks and months. By midwinter, the exhaustion alone created a gulf between the well-rested and the perpetually tired that no amount of individual determination could bridge. Military outposts represented an even more elaborate systematization of security. Fort Chipewyan, Fort William, Fort Union, these installations maintained winter garrisons of dozens or even hundreds of men, organized into rigid hierarchies with explicit chains of command. Here, night became something to be managed through procedure and protocol. Guards were posted according to military discipline, with specific orders about what required reporting, what could be ignored, and what justified raising alarm. The procedures themselves reflected accumulated wisdom about frontier dangers. Officers who had survived multiple winters codified their knowledge into standing orders that new arrivals could follow without needing to learn through potentially fatal trial and error. This institutional memory meant that each generation didn't start from scratch, didn't need to rediscover through bitter experience which threats were real and which were imagined. The system carried knowledge forward in time, independent of any individual's experience. Officers slept in quarters that were, by frontier standards, remarkably comfortable. log structures with proper floors, multiple rooms, stoves that provided consistent heat throughout the night. Some forts even maintained medical facilities with trained surgeons, meaning that illness or injury, the things that killed men in winter camps, became treatable rather than fatal. The presence of medical care transformed the calculation of risk entirely. A man who knew that frostbite could be treated, that infections could be addressed, that broken bones could be set properly, faced winter with fundamentally different psychology than one who knew that any serious injury meant death or permanent disability. The existence of medical resources created a buffer between accident and catastrophe. This buffer extended beyond physical injury to illness as well. Men in winter camps who fell sick either recovered through their own constitution or died, with little middle ground and no intervention. An officer retiring for the night in such a fort was separated from the winter darkness by multiple layers of protection, walls, guards, protocols, the presence of dozens of other men sleeping nearby, the knowledge that help was available if needed. His experience of night was so different from that of a trapper in a canvas tent that they might as well have been living in different centuries rather than merely different buildings. Yet they existed simultaneously, separated by only miles and the accidents of employment and social position. A day's journey might separate these two worlds, but the gulf in lived experience was measured in entirely different units than physical distance. The food situation alone represented an enormous disparity. Trading posts and forts maintained stores sufficient for the entire winter, with supplies carefully calculated and rationed to prevent shortage. Meals were regular and predictable, lacking variety but providing adequate nutrition. Men ate at designated times in communal spaces with the understanding that tomorrow's meal was assured. The psychological effect of food security cannot be overstated. Hunger gnaws at more than just the body. It occupies mental space, creates constant anxiety, makes every other problem seem more insurmountable. Compare this to winter camps, where food was whatever had been caught or carried, where meals were irregular and often insufficient, where the possibility of running out was a constant background concern. Hunger changes sleep, makes it lighter and more troubled, makes night feel longer and more threatening. The chronically hungry man dreams of food, wakes frequently, rises without the rest that sleep should provide. His body, sensing scarcity, refuses to fully relax, maintains a state of semi-alertness that prevents genuine restoration. The well-fed factor or officer could sleep through hunger's particular anxiety. Their night was not punctuated by the stomach's complaints or by calculations about remaining supplies. Morning came with the certainty of breakfast, afternoon with the certainty of an evening meal. This rhythm of certainty created a structure that extended far beyond mere nutrition into the realm of psychological stability. Yet even these privileged positions were not without their own relationship to darkness and winter. The factor in his trading post still heard the wind, still knew that walls could fail, that fires could die, that winter was only temporarily held at bay rather than truly defeated. His comfort was relative and conditional, dependent on systems that could break down, on supplies that could run out, on men who could desert or die. The infrastructure of safety was more robust than in winter camps, but it was not invulnerable. The factor lay awake sometimes, despite his comfortable bed, listening to the wind test the walls, wondering if the roof would hold under accumulating snow. His fears were different from those of men in canvas tents, but they were fears nonetheless. Letters from factors and fort commanders reveal an awareness of this fragility. They wrote of inspecting defenses, of checking supplies, of managing the men under their command with careful attention to morale and discipline. They understood that their authority and safety depended on the cooperation of those below them, on the maintenance of systems that required constant effort. A factor whose men mutinied or deserted found himself suddenly as vulnerable as any trapper. The correspondence reveals a persistent anxiety about maintaining control, about keeping men motivated through the long darkness, about preventing the kind of despair or resentment that could lead to violence or abandonment. Leadership in winter was its own form of vigilance, its own way of never fully sleeping. The social hierarchies themselves required enforcement and maintenance. The factor slept in his private quarters while hired men slept in common rooms, but this arrangement depended on everyone accepting its legitimacy. Any challenge to that legitimacy threatened not just social order but physical safety. If the men decided that the factor's extra warmth and comfort were unjust, they could simply take them. This never happened, or happened so rarely as to be remarkable when it did. The hierarchies held, maintained, by a combination of custom, economic dependency, and the promise that those who endured subordinate positions might eventually advance to higher ones. But the possibility of breakdown was always present, an additional source of anxiety for those who benefited from the system. The factor's better sleep came at the cost of managing relationships and maintaining authority, a different kind of nighttime vigilance. He had to balance being firm enough to maintain order with being fair enough to prevent rebellion. Too harsh and men would desert at first opportunity, too lenient and discipline would collapse along with the social structure that kept everyone alive. This balancing act played out in countless small decisions: how to allocate the best positions near the fire, how to distribute extra rations, when to punish infractions, and when to overlook them. Each decision either reinforced or eroded his authority. Winter nights at trading posts and forts were thus layered experiences, varying dramatically depending on one's position within the hierarchy. The factor had his private room, the guards had their sheltered posts, the hired men had their common quarters, and the indigenous peoples who came to trade had the spaces they were permitted to occupy, usually the least protected and most exposed. These spatial arrangements reflected and reinforced social relationships, making abstract hierarchies concrete and visible. You could see who mattered by observing who slept where, who got the warmth, who got the walls, who got the guards. The architecture embodied power in ways that required no verbal articulation. A closed door communicated authority more effectively than any spoken command. A raised bed demonstrated status more clearly than any title. The indigenous women who sometimes lived in or near trading posts occupied an ambiguous position in these hierarchies. As wives or companions of traders, they might share some protections, might sleep in warmer spaces, might have access to better food. But their position was precarious, dependent on relationships that could end at any time. Their nights were shaped by uncertainties that white men rarely faced, questions of belonging and safety that went beyond physical cold. A woman who shared a trader's quarters one winter might find herself excluded the next, relegated to the margins, her access to warmth and safety revoked with the relationship. This precariousness created its own form of vigilance, its own inability to fully rest. She existed between worlds, belonging fully to neither, with protections that were real but revocable. The walls that sheltered her could be withdrawn at any moment, and she knew it in ways that shaped every interaction, every night's attempt at sleep. The children born in these contexts inherited mixed legacies, some protection, but also some vulnerability, some access to institutional resources, but also some exclusion from them. Their experience of winter nights would have been uniquely complex, shaped by multiple cultural frameworks and social positions. A child with a European father and indigenous mother might sleep in a trading post, but never quite belong there, might have access to better food, but always be reminded of their marginal status. Their identity itself was a kind of boundary zone, neither inside nor outside the walls. As winter progressed, the differences between post and camp became more pronounced. In camps, resources dwindled and conditions deteriorated steadily. In posts, supplies remained adequate if not abundant, and structures maintained their integrity. By February or March, when camp dwellers were at their most exhausted and vulnerable, Post-residents were simply continuing their established routines. The gap in experience had widened from significant to vast. The late winter period revealed most starkly who had reserves and who had nothing left. Men in camps were surviving on stored body fat and diminished rations, while men in posts were perhaps slightly thinner but fundamentally sound. Yet everyone, regardless of position, still waited for spring. The factor in his comfortable quarters was still trapped by winter, still unable to leave, still dependent on the season eventually changing. His comfort made the waiting more bearable, but it didn't eliminate the waiting itself. He too counted days, watched for signs of thaw, anticipated the moment when travel would again be possible. The psychological weight of confinement pressed on everyone, regardless of how comfortable that confinement was. The walls that provided protection also created imprisonment, and even the best appointed fort was still a cage, once rivers froze and trails became impassable. In this sense, winter imposed a strange democracy of imprisonment. Everyone was confined, everyone was waiting, everyone was subject to forces beyond their control. The difference was merely in how uncomfortable that confinement was, how dangerous that waiting felt, how close to disaster everyone stood. Some stood at the edge with every night bringing them closer to collapse, while others stood well back from the edge, buffered by walls and supplies and systems. This distance from disaster was perhaps the truest measure of privilege on the frontier. Not luxury or comfort in any absolute sense, but rather the space between your current position and catastrophic failure. The factor had space. The fort commander had even more. The trapper in his canvas tent had almost none, and the indigenous peoples displaced by the fur trade's expansion often had less than none, already past the edge and surviving through means that left few historical traces. For those pushed beyond the edge, survival became something that happened outside the documented record. They appear in journals as abstractions, hostile Indians, natives encountered, but their actual experience of winter nights remains largely unrecorded. The archaeology of trading posts reveals this stratification in material form. Excavations show distinct areas with different qualities of construction, different quantities of goods, different kinds of refuse. The factor's quarters yield fragments of better quality pottery, evidence of more varied diet, personal items that suggest leisure time and disposable income. The common quarters yield fewer such items, simpler refuse, evidence of more austere existence. These material differences accumulated over winter, night by night, meal by meal, fire by fire, until spring revealed who had endured with relative ease and who had barely survived. The revelation was visible in bodies, in health, in the energy people had or didn't have for the season ahead. Some men emerged from winter capable of another year of work, others emerged damaged, aged, less capable than before, and some didn't emerge at all, buried in snow or recorded in journals as died over winter, with no additional detail. The casual notation of death in winter records speaks to its commonness, its expectedness. Men died, this was acknowledged, and the record moved on to matters of inventory and trade prospects. The factors and commanders who survived winter after winter often attributed their success to discipline, planning, and good management. They weren't entirely wrong. Their systems did provide real protection, but they rarely acknowledged how much their survival depended on occupying positions that gave them first access to those systems' benefits. Their discipline was easier because they were warmer, their planning more effective because they were better fed, their management smoother because they slept better at night. The cycle reinforced itself. Those who survived winters well were judged competent and promoted to positions of greater responsibility and comfort, which made subsequent winters easier still, which led to further advancement. Those who struggled through winters barely surviving were judged less capable and remained in exposed positions, which made future winters equally difficult, which prevented advancement. Success bred success, and hardship bred further hardship. The system appeared meritocratic. Those who succeeded advanced, those who failed did not, but the appearance obscured how much success depended on initial position. The man who started with advantages kept accumulating more, while the man who started with none found it nearly impossible to break the cycle. Occasionally, someone crossed from one world to the other, a capable trapper promoted to factor, a failed factor demoted back to laborer. These transitions revealed how much of the difference was structural rather than personal. The newly promoted trapper discovered that being a factor was easier, not because he had changed, but because the role itself provided advantages. The demoted factor discovered that survival in a winter camp was harder, not because he had lost ability, but because the position itself offered fewer protections. These revelations were rarely discussed openly. To acknowledge that position mattered more than personal quality would undermine the entire social hierarchy that made the fur trade function. So instead, everyone maintained the fiction that comfort and safety were earned through merit, that those who had them deserved them, that those who didn't failed somehow to measure up. The fiction was transparent but necessary, believed and disbelieved simultaneously. Men participated in the fiction even while privately understanding its falseness. They spoke of advancement through hard work while knowing that connections and luck mattered more, praised their superiors' wisdom while recognizing that better sleep and food made wisdom easier. As spring approached and travel became possible again, the differentiated experiences of winter began to blur. Everyone emerged into daylight, into activity, into the renewal of trade and travel and work. The specific quality of each person's winter, how cold they had been, how hungry, how afraid, receded into private memory. Publicly, everyone had survived winter, and survival was treated as a binary outcome rather than a spectrum of experience. The factor had survived, the trapper had survived, the guard, the laborer, the indigenous trader, all had survived. The fact that they had survived in dramatically different conditions with vastly different levels of comfort and safety became socially invisible even though it remained personally obvious. This collective amnesia served important functions. It allowed hierarchies to persist without constant justification, allowed relationships to continue without resentment boiling over, allowed the fur trade to function as an economic system despite its profound injustices. But the amnesia was never complete. Bodies remembered what minds chose to forget. The trapper who had survived winter in a canvas tent carried that experience in his bones, in his scarred hands, in his damaged health. The factor who had slept in relative comfort also carried his experience in his confidence, in his expectation of safety, in his assumption that systems would protect him. These bodily memories shaped behavior in ways that were rarely conscious but always present. When these men interacted in spring and summer, they brought their different winters with them, invisible but influential. The factor's casual assumption of authority, the trapper's careful deference, the guard's disciplined efficiency, all these behaviors had been shaped by winter nights spent in very different circumstances. The social dynamics of spring bore the imprint of winter's hierarchies. Men who had been warm gave orders to men who had been cold, and both understood implicitly that this was the natural order of things. And so the cycle prepared to repeat. As spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, everyone knew that winter would return. The factor began preparing his stores, the trapper began worrying about where he would spend the cold months, the guard accepted his contract for another season. Each person approached the coming winter with knowledge shaped by past winters, with expectations calibrated to their position in the hierarchy. The factor expected to survive comfortably, the trapper expected to endure difficulty, and both expectations were likely to be fulfilled. The system perpetuated itself with minimal conscious effort, each person playing their assigned role, each night of winter reinforcing the patterns that would shape the next night. and the next winter. Change happened slowly, if at all, and usually only through crisis that disrupted the established order. But crisis was always possible. A fire could destroy a trading post, reducing a factor to the same vulnerability as his men. A particularly harsh winter could kill even those with walls and guards. An indigenous uprising could overturn all the careful hierarchies in a single night of violence. These possibilities haunted the comfortable as much as the cold haunted the exposed. Different fears for different positions, but fear nonetheless, a recognition that winter and darkness respected no human arrangements, that safety was always provisional, that the night might bring anything at all. The factor lying in his bed knew that fire could reach even him, that walls could be breached, that the men sleeping in the common quarters might decide one night that the distribution of warmth and safety was unfair. This knowledge never quite left him, even in his warmest and most comfortable moments. The guard standing watch knew that cold could overwhelm even institutional protection, that his designated post and scheduled relief were only effective so long as the larger system held together. Any breakdown in supply lines, any desertion of key personnel, any unexpected severity in the weather could collapse the careful structure. And when the night came, as it always did, each person faced it according to their means and their position. Some faced it from behind thick walls with guards standing watch, others from canvas shelters with only their own vigilance for protection. The night was the same for everyone, the same darkness, the same cold, the same hours to endure. But the experience of that sameness varied so profoundly that it might as well have been different nights entirely, different winters, different worlds, separated by walls and hierarchies, and the arbitrary distribution of comfort and safety. The stars that appeared in the winter sky shone on everyone equally, but meant different things depending on whether you viewed them through a window from a warm room, or studied them while standing guard, or saw them through a gap in canvas while trying to keep a fire alive. The same celestial objects, the same physical phenomena, but entirely different human meanings. The wind that howled across the frontier carried the same temperature, the same velocity, the same potential for harm to every structure and every person. But it encountered different resistances, thick walls that turned it aside, canvas that merely slowed it, human bodies that bore its full force with nothing but their own skin for protection. The factor settled into his bed, secure in his room. The trapper curled beside his fire, hoping for dawn, and somewhere between them, in gradations of comfort and danger, everyone else arranged themselves for another night of waiting, another passage through darkness toward whatever morning might bring. The hierarchy continued its work even in sleep, even in darkness, sorting people into categories of safety and exposure. Morning would find some refreshed and others exhausted, some ready for another day, and others barely capable of continuing. The gulf between them widened by another night's unequal distribution of rest and warmth, and the night itself, indifferent to all human arrangements, simply was what it was. Hours of darkness to be endured, cold to be survived, time to be passed until the sun returned and made visible again the world that night had temporarily obscured. The frontier darkness treated everyone the same, but humanity had arranged itself so that this equal treatment produced profoundly unequal outcomes night after night, winter after winter, for as long as the fur trade endured. The nights we have drifted through together, these long, cold passages of waiting and watching, belong to a world that has vanished almost completely. The frontier winter camps are gone, their shelters collapsed and rotted, their fires long since cold. The men who endured those nights have been dead for more than a century, their names mostly forgotten, their specific struggles dissolved into general history. But something of their experience persists, if only in the imagination, in the effort to understand what their nights felt like. We have followed them through the daily hardship of camp life, through the particular struggles of men like Jean-Baptiste Larocque, through the mystery of what they believed and feared about darkness. We have seen how some men were protected by walls and systems, while others faced winter with only canvas and fire. These were not dramatic stories. No great battles were fought, no famous events occurred, no history was made in the sense that historians usually measure such things. These were simply nights, thousands of them, tens of thousands, endured by unnamed men in temporary camps waiting for morning with a patience born of having no alternative. The nights accumulated into winters, the winters into lifetimes, the lifetimes into a historical period that eventually ended when the frontier closed and the old patterns of life disappeared. What remains is this echo, this attempt to reconstruct experience from fragments and evidence, to understand what it meant to be cold and dark and vigilant in an era before electricity and central heating transformed night into something manageable. We can never fully recover that experience, but we can acknowledge that it happened, that it mattered to those who lived through it. You, listening now in whatever comfort you possess, warm room, soft bed, light available at the touch of a switch, inhabit a world that those frontier men would have found miraculous. The simple fact that you can banish darkness instantly, that you can warm yourself without gathering wood, that you can sleep without vigilance, would have seemed to them like magic. Yet your night and their night are the same night, the same rotation of the earth away from the sun, the same hours of darkness. Only the experience of that darkness has changed, softened by technology into something no longer threatening. The camps are gone, but the darkness they feared is still there, behind your lights, waiting in whatever spaces electricity hasn't reached. We have pushed it back, made it smaller, made it optional, but we haven't eliminated it. On some level, we remember what darkness meant to our ancestors, remember that it was something to be managed and survived rather than simply experienced. That memory lives in us even when we don't acknowledge it, shapes our spaces and our habits in ways we rarely examine. We still light our homes at night, still lock our doors, still feel some small anxiety when the power fails and darkness reasserts itself suddenly. These are echoes of the vigilance that once defined every winter night, reduced now to barely noticeable habits, but never quite eliminated. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps we should remember that comfort and safety are achievements, not givens, that the ease with which we move through darkness is the result of centuries of effort and innovation. The men in frontier winter camps didn't have that ease. They had only fire and canvas and their own endurance, and somehow it was enough, barely, to carry them through to morning. We honor them not by romanticizing their hardship, but by acknowledging it clearly, by understanding that their nights were difficult in ways ours are not, that they endured things we have been spared. Their survival was not heroic in the dramatic sense, but it was remarkable in the quiet sense of deserving to be remarked upon. They sat in cold shelters and tended failing fires and waited for dawn, night after night, winter after winter. They did this not because they were exceptional, but because it was necessary, because the alternative was death, because morning always seemed worth waiting for. And morning always came, eventually. The darkness always lifted. The cold remained, but the night ended, and that ending was enough reason to face the next night, and the next, until finally spring arrived and freed them from the cycle. We, listening in our comfort, can appreciate the contrast. How far we have come from those cold nights. How different our relationship with darkness has become. We can rest easy, knowing that our night will be short and warm and safe, that dawn will arrive without our having to earn it through vigilance. Let their struggles settle into your awareness gently, becoming part of the background of your thoughts as you drift toward sleep. Let the rhythm of their nights, the watching, the waiting, the patient endurance, become a lullaby of sorts, a reminder that you are safe in ways they never were. The fire in the winter camp has gone out, the canvas has rotted away, the men have long since died and been forgotten, but their nights somehow continue in memory, in imagination, in the quiet acknowledgement that such nights happened and mattered and shaped the world you now inhabit. Rest now in your warmth, in your safety, in your freedom from the vigilance that once defined every winter darkness. Let the distance between their experience and yours become a source of gratitude rather than anxiety, a reminder of comfort rather than a prompt to fear. The nights are easier now. Let that easiness carry you gently into sleep, into rest, into the quiet darkness that holds no threat, that requires no watching, that will lift on its own when morning comes. And morning will come, as it always does, bringing light and warmth and the simple gift of another day. For now, though, there is only night, soft, safe, and yours to sleep through without concern. Let go of the frontier, let go of the cold, let go of the watching and waiting. Those nights are over. This night is gentle. Rest now. Rest.